Hi. There's something I've had in my studio set up for a while which totally upgraded my experience and which, as I watch studio tours every now and then, I didn't see anyone else doing, so I thought I'd share it with you along with a few tips on how to optimize things. The issue that I had when my setup was like the ones you see on screen is that what we use to hear the music we make, the speakers, are optimized not only for a single spot, but also for a listening position that's facing the speakers. If all your gear is in front of you, that's okay, but when you want to use gear that's on either side of the setup to play a synth or to tweak a compressor, you end up effectively hearing the music in mono and mostly in one ear, which is kind of like listening to music with only one earbud, not a very enjoyable experience. The solution that I found to this problem is to add a couple of speakers to the setup, not necessarily as good or expensive as the main ones, but when you balance them, as I'll show you in the video, the result is a considerably more enjoyable studio experience overall, regardless of which direction you're facing or where you are exactly. A bonus perk of such a quad setup is that if you configure your computer correctly, and I'll show you how in this video, you can enjoy movies and music that support surround sound and Dolby Atmos. Most top songs released these days support Dolby Atmos, and even if you have no current intention of creating music in the format, it's a ton of fun to listen to and to learn from how creators are making music in this interesting spatial format. Before I dive into the details, a quick disclosure. Some of the gear you'll see in this video was either provided at no cost or significantly less than retail, but no company has any say over the content of this video, and other than the gear, no money changed hands. And then one more note before I get into this multi-speaker business. Another way to solve the location in the studio problem is simply using headphones, though of course that won't give you a good experience for surround music, and you'll need to have headphones on your head. Okay, so the first thing to consider is which speakers to add to your setup. While ideally you'll want speakers that are identical to your main speakers, that might not be practical in terms of size or cost. What I've found is that a smaller but good quality speaker works very well as long as you balance levels with the bigger speaker. I'm not saying you should make mixed decisions based on two different speakers, but having a speaker on either side of your listening position gives a great stereo image and is way better than just hearing effectively in mono on one side. There are plenty of excellent, small, but powerful speakers out there. In no way have I tried enough to make a recommendation of what's the best value. I can just say that I've been enjoying these small iLoud MTMs a lot, and while I still prefer my main speakers, the more expensive Precision MTMs, this pairing works just fine as long as they're level balanced. I also experimented with the AIAIAI Unit 4s. They pair up very nicely with bigger speakers as well and have the advantage of being totally wireless, so you can just pick them up and place them anywhere you want in your studio. As a matter of fact, if you don't mind moving the speakers around, you can do with just a pair of wireless speakers that you place wherever you need to be. The AIAIAIs do have a bit of latency though, so if you pair them with wired speakers, you'll need to adjust for that. I'll show you how to do that in a bit. Okay, so you've decided to add one or two speakers in additional places in your setup. There are a few questions this brings up. The first of which is how do you wire them, unless you have wireless ones, and balance levels with your main speakers? And then how do you control levels overall once it's set up? If you only have a simple audio interface, an easy way to start experimenting is to use the headphone output of your interface with a stereo to dual mono splitter cable to send audio to each speaker. Hopefully it has separate level control than that of the main monitors, so that you can use that to match the level of the front monitors to the back ones. To match levels, you can either do it by ear, use a microphone, or check levels in an app like this one. It's called Decibel. Send noise to each speaker individually and measure levels so they're the same. Try to keep the microphone away from yourself as much as possible to avoid reflections, and certainly don't put yourself between the speaker and the microphone. So using the headphone output of an audio interface is a good way to start, but there are quite a few cons to this. First, headphone outputs aren't balanced, so running long cables around your studio may introduce noise into the setup. Second, it's going to take up the headphone output of your interface, which you may want to use. Third, depending on your audio interface, the headphone output may not be separately addressable, but rather be a copy of the main outputs, so you won't be able to use this solution for surround or spatial setups. And then probably the biggest con is that to adjust levels in your studio, you'll need to turn two knobs, both the one for the monitor and the one for the headphones, and keep both of them in balance, which is quite a pain. So a better option than using a simple interface would be to use an audio interface with 4 independently addressable outputs. These will free up the headphone outputs of your interface, let you use this for surround music, but on simpler interfaces, you still don't have central control for all 4 outputs. The monitor knob will typically control the first two outputs. If you want to control the level of these, you'll either need to do it in the companion software or potentially use a separate monitor controller and have that control the level of the two rear speakers. But then you still have to turn two knobs to control levels, which, trust me, over time is no fun in the setup. So there are two ways to do that. To have one volume control knob rule all the speakers in your setup, it's either get an interface that supports that or a software solution that solves that problem. On the audio interface side, this typically means getting a higher end one that lets you control multiple speakers with the main monitor knob. On some interfaces, you'll see this feature called VCA groups. I use an RME interface, the UCX2, and in this one you can set up fader groups to control multiple outputs at once. So for example, here as I move the main knob, I'm also moving the faders for these outputs. And if the speakers on the outputs are different sizes or levels, I can always fine tune and adjust these and go back to controlling levels for the different speakers, but now adjusted for their relative volume. So that's how you set things up on RME interfaces. Arturia just added central volume control for more than two speakers in a recent firmware update to their 16 rig. And if you're familiar with other interfaces with that feature, please add a comment below. Okay, next tip, once you have everything going, when using stereo sources, I swap between the left and right audio signals going to the rear speakers. The first reason is because it makes for a generally pleasurable spatial experience when you're sitting here, even though the signal is in stereo. For example, let's say with a ping pong delay. So I send a copy of this signal to here and a copy of this signal to this speaker. So when I turn to face either side, I'm still getting a stereo image as opposed to just a copy of this one, which would be a mono signal all over again. The way I have this set up in Total Mix, by the way, is that if I look at the sources going to the main output, that's the left and right signal coming from my DAW. And then this speaker, which is the analog output, gets audio from the right channel coming out of my DAW. And this speaker, analog 4, gets audio coming from the left side. Now, while having 4 speakers firing at the same time is a lot of fun, it can cause some phasing issues if you want to focus on the mix when you're looking either to the left or to the right. If you have an audio interface with snapshots or presets, then you can quickly swap between different setups. So an example, again, within the RME ecosystem, in this snapshot, all 4 speakers are firing. In this one, only the 2 left speakers are firing. And in this one, only the 2 right ones. It's pretty easy to set these mixes up within the Total Mix software. This snapshot, by the way, number 1, is for when all speakers are firing different audio signals. And then before I move to software solutions, a totally different option to address the other location within your studio. If you don't have instruments set up on both sides, let's say on just one, and you've got a monitor controller, those that are typically designed to let you A/B between 2 pairs of speakers. If you're not A/Bing the speakers, you could always take these 2 speakers, place them to the left and right of your secondary position, and then use the A/B switch to toggle between the 2 sitting positions. So up until now, I've been talking about hardware solutions to manage all this. As of the making of this video, the only software solution that I'm aware of that elegantly solves this problem is Sphere by Ginger Audio. I tried it and it works really well. The only problem is that it's designed for high-end speaker setups and it's priced accordingly. It's feature-rich and a bit complex to set up. And if you have an 8 or 16 speaker setup, I'd even call it cost-effective. I just wish they'd come up with a quad version priced somewhere in the middle. I'm not going to go over it in detail because it's quite complex and they've got good tutorials on their website. In a nutshell, it installs itself as a virtual audio interface in your system. You tell it how many speakers you have and you can set them up pretty much any way you like. And besides giving you a central volume control for everything, which you can MIDI map as well if you want, you can also create multiple snapshots and MIDI control them as well, just like I did with the RME controller. It has a few other features I'll talk about in a bit, but overall a great way to take a simple interface like this and turn it into something that lets you do all the combinations of stereo I talked about earlier. This software also supports Atmos and Quad, which is a good segue into the second reason I made this video, not just to let you get a good stereo image regardless of where you're facing or where you're at in your studio. Like I mentioned, there's plenty of Atmos and surround video and audio content out there. For us audio music makers, you'll need to use a streaming service that supports surround sound or Atmos. As of the making of this video, the most popular one is Apple Music. Every time I checked recently, most of the top Billboard songs support Atmos, and there are plenty of back catalog songs in Atmos, as well as many modern releases that don't necessarily make it to the top 10. For example, this week, Bon Iver's new release is available in Atmos, or for self-promotion alert, my upcoming live quadraphonic show album. To set this up technically on a Mac, go to Audio MIDI Setup, click on the interface that's active in your system, and then click on Configure Speakers. You can choose from multiple combinations of speakers. Quadraphonic is what we're going for. And then for each speaker as illustrated in the drawing, you'll need to hook up the relevant audio output that its cable is connected to. You can even use this icon to generate noise to set the relative levels. And that's pretty much it. Music should just flow quadraphonically from your speakers whenever it's streaming from an Atmos source. For PCs, I'm not a Windows user, but I did some dabbling on some interfaces, assuming they have the appropriate driver installed. Hitting configure in the sound settings will let you choose different surround speaker arrangements. Okay, so assuming you've got everything set up properly, let's talk about fine-tuning the setup. If you want to use headphones every now and then, which you will, make sure the headphone mix receives audio from all 4 quad sources. Otherwise, you'll only hear just half of the mix. Then to balance the levels of the different speakers, either use a microphone or a dB meter like I showed you earlier. And then there are 2 options: generate these bursts of sound and tweak the volume levels on your individual speakers. The problem is that's not something you want to run around and do for each listening position. If your interface supports it, you could set relative levels on a per snapshot basis. Regarding room treatment, since sound is now coming from multiple directions, typical stereo room treatment probably won't be sufficient. Proper treatment for surround setups is way beyond the scope of this video and my skill set. However, I found that per speaker room correction can be helpful. Generally speaking, I prefer speakers with built-in room correction DSP. However, if your speakers don't support built-in room correction, your audio interface might. So for example, within Total Mix, I set up these 2 EQ notches to fight modes within this space. Now, if you'd like to know how I came up with this curve, I made a whole video about the topic. I'll link to it below. Basically, you use the free Room EQ Wizard software. It may seem intimidating at first, but give it a try. Basically, you sweep the room for each of the speakers, and then it outputs 2, 3, 4, or 5 EQ changes that target specific resonating frequencies within your room. Finally, if your interface or volume control supports it, you might want to be aware of and fix timing delays between the speakers you use. All 3 products I tried for this video, 16 Rig, UCX2, and the Sphere software support setting custom timing delays per speaker. And there are 2 reasons you might want to delay the sound coming out of 1 or more speakers in your setup. First, depending on what you're doing, you may be sitting at a location where you're not an equal distance from all 4 speakers. You certainly need to adjust levels in this case, but you might also want to adjust for the time delays. And then the second reason may cause even more prominent delays. As increasingly speakers have DSP processing, they may introduce additional latency compared to totally analog speakers or different models of speakers. Especially if you use the wireless speakers I mentioned earlier from AIAIAI, their delay isn't too bad. It's 16 milliseconds, but it's still more than the other speakers I use in my setup. So how do you measure this? If your speakers are identical, you can ignore their DSP processing time and use a simple tape measure. Sound travels at 34 centimeters or 13.5 inches per millisecond. So if you're not an equal distance from all your speakers, you need to add a delay so that the ones closest to you wait a bit for the ones that are the farthest away. So how do you measure this delay? I set up a project as follows. I've got these 2 clips sending little sine pings to each of the 4 speakers in succession with panning automation, as you can see here. And then I set up these 2 tracks to resample this audio. And then finally, I placed a microphone at the listening position. And if I go into arrangement view, you'll see that these are my 4 pings raw. This is me babbling something. And then here are 4 raw pings. This is what's being sent out, and this is what's being received on the microphone. Specifically here, I put the microphone at a position like this one, where it's really close to one speaker, but then farther away from the other 3. That's why this one is recorded at a much louder level. So clearly I need to balance levels for this crazy setup, which isn't really practical, but it makes for a good demo. Anyway, so if I zoom into here, you'll see I can measure a latency of about 3 milliseconds to the closest speaker. You can see that on the bottom of the screen. That's pretty much the audio interface's latency because I put the microphone really close to it. I was actually here when I recorded it, by the way. So this is speaker number 1 or beep number 1. Beep number 2 is over here. So let's take a look at that. That's a delay of 6 milliseconds. Then speaker number 3, that's this one. That's going to give us, I'll fast forward through this. about 7 milliseconds. And then for speaker number 4, that's going to come in at about 10 milliseconds. So depending on your interface, that would be the delay parameter, or in the case of the Sphere software, that lives over here. So I would set no delay for this speaker. I'd set a 7 millisecond delay for this one, a 4 millisecond delay for this one, and a 3 millisecond delay for this one. So that's it for now. If you work in more than one place within your studio, I highly recommend trying this out. And certainly if you're curious about Atmos or quad music, this is a lot of fun as well. You'll find all these tips and more in my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful. Ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.